Look at this. A $50 million masterpiece, the pinnacle of modern aerospace being tainted by your very presence. Julian Sterling, the chief engineer, sneered as he loomed over Maya. With a flick of his wrist, he intentionally knocked a full, steaming cup of black coffee onto the pristine hangar floor and directly onto the hem of Maya's worn-out custodial uniform. He kicked the mop bucket toward her, sending gray, soapy water splashing against her work boots. "Clean it up, Maya. That's what you people are good for, isn't it?" A black woman holding a mop has no business standing near a miracle of engineering. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Did you really think the universe would allow someone like you to understand the genius behind this engine? You're just a background noise in a world of giants." As Maya knelt to wipe the mess, he laughed loud and sharp. "Make sure you scrub hard, Maya. Maybe if you spend enough time on your knees, you'll finally learn your place in the food chain." Will Maya ever get the chance to prove them all wrong? Don't miss this journey of dignity and hidden genius. Where are you watching from? Comment your location and local time. Subscribe to follow the full story. The Sterling Aerospace hangar was more than just a workspace. It was a cathedral of human ambition located on the outskirts of Seattle. Here the air was perpetually conditioned, smelling faintly of synthetic lubricant and ozone. Under the brilliant shadowless glare of the LED arrays, the Titan X prototype sat like a predatory god of metal and carbon fiber. It was valued at $50 million a figure that made even the wealthiest stakeholders sweat. Julian Sterling, the third-generation lead engineer, treated this hangar as his private kingdom. He was a man who measured his life in tolerances and pressure readings. His father had built the company. His grandfather had paved the runway. Julian was expected to launch a dynasty. The Titan X wasn't just an engine. It was supposed to be the breakthrough that would secure a decade-long exclusive contract with the Department of Defense. If it failed, Sterling Aerospace would go bankrupt, and Julian's name would be forever tarnished. The team working under him consisted of the finest minds in aviation, men and women recruited from MIT Caltech and the corridors of NASA. They walked with an air of calculated arrogance, their credentials hanging from their necks like medals of honor. Among them was the junior apprentice Leo, a young man who possessed a shred of empathy that the veterans had long ago discarded. While the elite engineers discussed thrust vectors and fuel mixture ratios, Maya was a ghost in the machine. Her shift began at 4 a.m. long before the sun touched the gray Seattle sky. Her domain was the peripheral, the dust on the floor tiles, the oily fingerprints on the glass partitions, and the trash cans filled with the remnants of the engineer's stress, empty energy drink, cans, discarded schematics, and crumpled lunch wrappers. Maya was 52 years old, with calloused hands and a quiet, observant gaze that saw far more than anyone gave her credit for. She had been here for 3 years. She knew the cadence of the hangar better than the security system. She knew that Tommy, the senior fuel specialist, always spilled a drop of coffee at 8:15 a.m. She knew that Julian Sterling had a tick in his left eye when the pressure readings reached critical thresholds. Most importantly, she knew the voice of the Titan X. To everyone else, the engine was a static object when it wasn't running. To Maya, it was a living, breathing entity. In the quiet hours of the early morning, when the facility was nearly empty, the metal would groan as it cooled. It whispered in the language of physics. She didn't have a PhD, but she had Elijah Hayes's notebook. Her father had been a man who could listen to a car engine from a block away and diagnose a bad cylinder before the driver even got out. He had taught her that a machine is only as good as its harmony. As the week of the final flight test approached, the tension in the hangar thickened. Billionaire owner Elias Thorne was coming to oversee the final run. Thorne was a man of few words and immense ruthlessness. He didn't care about excuses. He cared about results. Julian Sterling had personally promised him a success that would rewrite the record books. The stakes weren't just financial, they were existential. Every engineer in the room was sleep-deprived, irritable, and terrified. They pushed the engine-running simulation after simulation, demanding perfection from an object that was clearly showing signs of distress. Maya watched from the doorway, her broom resting against her hip. She heard the faint, high-pitched whine that the diagnostic monitors dismissed as background electronic noise. She felt the floor vibrate with a slight, irregular pulse that shouldn't have been there. She wanted to say something, but she had learned the lesson of the silent witness years ago. To the men in the white lab coats, she was invisible, or worse, an inconvenience. She turned to continue her cleaning, feeling the heavy impending weight of a disaster that only she could sense while the men inside prepared for a triumph that would never come. The morning of the final pre-flight test arrived with a leaden sky and a biting wind. The hangar was packed. Elias Thorne sat in the observation booth, his eyes fixed on the panoramic window. Julian Sterling paced the floor, his face a mask of controlled panic. He had skipped sleep for 48 hours. His shirt was rumpled, and his hands trembled slightly as he grabbed a tablet, barking orders at his team. "We go live in 5 minutes," Julian shouted, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "I want full diagnostic readouts on every screen. If there is even a micro-fluctuation in the pressure, I want to know about it. This engine is our legacy. Do not fail me." Maya was mopping the area near the fuel control terminal, her movements rhythmic and practiced. She had been there since 4 a.m. cleaning up the mess left by the night shift. She noticed the way the Titan X sat on its mountings. It looked sluggish, almost burdened. As Julian walked past her, he didn't look at her, but he kicked the corner of her mop bucket, splashing gray water across the pristine floor. "Get this garbage out of here, Maya," Julian muttered, his voice cold. "And don't you dare stand anywhere near the testing zone. Your presence is distracting. If I see you within 10 feet of the Titan, you're fired." Maya didn't retort. She simply pulled her bucket back and retreated to the shadows of the secondary bay, her heart thumping against her ribs. She could hear it, that high, thin frequency that was getting louder. It wasn't electronic. It was metal fatigue. "Initiating start sequence," Tommy Blake announced over the comm system. The hangar fell silent. The air seemed to compress. The Titan X began to turn over. It was a beautiful, terrifying sound, a deep, rhythmic roar that promised to shatter the sound barrier. The initial phase went well. The monitors glowed with soothing green light. Julian Sterling exhaled, his shoulders dropping an inch. Thorne nodded in the observation booth. Then, at 7:14 a.m., the harmony shattered. It started as a metallic thud, deep and dissonant like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. Then came a grinding sound, a jagged, screeching vibration that sounded like teeth tearing through sheet metal. The Titan X shuddered violently on its mounts. Flames sputtered from the exhaust port, and then with a deafening pop, the engine seized. Every screen on the diagnostic rack flatlined instantly. The silence that followed was total, heavy with the weight of $50 million vanishing into thin air. "What happened?" Thorne's voice boomed over the intercom, cold and dangerous. "Report." Julian rushed to the control console, his face a ghostly pale. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I don't know. The sensors show all systems nominal. There is no fault code. The computer says the engine is perfect. It just died. It's not perfect." Leo, the junior apprentice, shouted from the back, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. Within minutes, the hangar was a swarm of panic. Senior engineers rushed the engine, tearing off panels, hooking up portable diagnostic rigs, and arguing in hushed, frantic tones. They were the finest minds in the country, but they were looking at the world through digital filters. They checked the software logs. They inspected the fuel injectors. They scanned the thermal readouts. Nothing. Not a single error message. The engine looked pristine, yet it was a piece of dead weight. Maya stood in the corner, her hands clasped tightly around the handle of her mop. She saw the truth. She saw the way the casing of the third turbine had micro-shifted during the thermal expansion phase. She saw the way the fuel flow was slightly constricted, not by the computer, but by a mechanical misalignment in the intake valve that the sensors were literally too smart to notice. "It's the vibration," she whispered to herself. The sensors were designed to ignore minor vibrations to prevent false positives, and because of that, they were ignoring the catastrophe. Julian was pacing, his hair disheveled. "We have the launch event in 6 hours. If this engine doesn't fire, we're done, we are finished." He reached for a wrench, his movements erratic, and slammed it into the side of the workbench. A small brass object fell from his pocket, a key. He ignored it, his eyes wild. Thorne was coming down from the booth, his face thunderous. The failure was absolute, and the pride of the Sterling family lay in ruins. The experts were paralyzed by their own reliance on the machines, completely unable to see the mechanical reality staring them in the face. Maya moved through the chaos like a shadow, though her mind was racing. She remembered the shed in rural Georgia, the humid heat of summer, and the flickering light bulb that hung over her father's workspace. Elijah Hayes didn't have high-tech scanners. He had a screwdriver, a set of feeler gauges, and a set of ears that could detect a misaligned piston ring from 20 feet away. She kept her gaze on the Titan X. The engine looked dead, but she could feel the residual heat, the tension still locked within its steel heart. She retreated to the small utility closet at the back of the hangar, where she kept her cleaning supplies. In the bottom of her locker, tucked behind a bucket of floor wax, was a worn leather notebook. It was stained with oil and age. The pages were yellowed, and the edges were frayed. She opened it to a page dated November 1982. Her father's handwriting, careful slanting script, filled the page with diagrams of valve timings and pressure resonance. He had written, "The machines will lie to you if you let them. They only know what they are programmed to see. But the metal tells the truth if you are willing to be quiet enough to hear it." Maya felt a surge of grief and determination. Her father had died in that shed, his lungs filled with the dust of a lifetime of work he was never allowed to be credited for. He had applied to every aviation repair shop in the Southeast, and every single one had slammed the door in his face. They didn't want a black mechanic touching their planes. They didn't want a man who couldn't show them a degree, even if he could fix an engine in the dark. She stood in the closet for a moment, letting the silence settle over her. She knew the mechanics of this engine better than any of them. For 3 years, she had spent her breaks sitting on the floor behind the crates, watching, listening, and cross-referencing every move the elite engineers made. When they were at lunch, she would stand near the turbine and study the way the cooling vents were aligned. She had even corrected a fuel relay misfire herself 6 months ago during the graveyard shift. She had nudged a loose coupling with a screwdriver, and when Tommy Blake had returned the next morning, he had simply scratched his head and said, "Well, I'll be damned, it fixed itself." She didn't tell anyone. She knew better. In a world of giants, a black woman with a mop was just scenery. But today was different. Today, $50 million was on the line, and if the engine stayed silent, it would be the end of the careers of men like Julian Sterling. She looked at her father's notebook one last time. There was a specific formula he used for high-compression turbines, a method of calculating thermal expansion that defied the standard algorithms. It was simple, elegant, and ignored by the modern manuals. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the closet. The hangar was a cacophony of shouting and blame. Julian was screaming at a senior technician, his face purple. Elias Thorne stood in the center of the room, his silence more terrifying than any shout. "This is impossible," Julian bellowed. "I checked the cooling assembly twice. The diagnostic software gives it a clean bill of health." Maya walked toward the center of the room. Her knees were shaking, but her face was calm. She held her mop in one hand and the leather notebook hidden in the pocket of her apron. As she stepped into the circle, the shouting died down. "What do you think you're doing, Maya?" Julian snarled, his eyes narrowing. "I told you to stay away from the testing zone. I am in the middle of a national crisis here, and you are trying to push your filthy mop into my workspace." "I know why the engine stopped, Mr. Sterling," Maya said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent floor. The room erupted in laughter. It was a cruel, sharp sound. Tommy Blake guffawed, wiping his forehead with a grease-stained rag. "The janitor." "You heard her, Julian. The janitor wants to solve the Titan X problem." Julian didn't laugh. He looked disgusted, as if he were looking at an insect on a wedding cake. He walked toward her, his movements aggressive. He stopped just inches from her face, his cologne smelling of expensive, sterile chemicals. "Listen to me, you pathetic woman." Julian hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "You mop floors. You scrub the grease off the tiles that my engineers leave behind. That is your level. Do not ever think that because you spend your nights in this building you have the right to speak to me about aerospace engineering. A black woman like you has no business in a technical conversation. Get out before I have security throw you out into the street." He reached out and snatched the broom from her hand, throwing it across the room. It clattered against the wall, a hollow sound that seemed to echo into every corner of the hangar. "And if I ever see you near this engine again," Julian continued, his eyes cold, "I will make sure you never find work in this city again. You are nothing. Do you understand me? You are invisible." Maya stood her ground, her gaze fixed on the Titan X. "The sensor in the third turbine," she said, her voice steady. "It's not broken. It's miscalibrated because of the harmonic resonance in the intake manifold. It's not a software error, Mr. Sterling. It's a structural vibration. You're trying to read a whisper in a thunderstorm." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Julian's face turned from pale to a deep, dark red. He looked at Elias Thorne, then back at Maya. The humiliation was total. He signaled to the security guard standing by the bay doors. "Get her out of my sight," Julian commanded. "Drag her out. If she steps foot in this hangar again, I'll sue the cleaning company for everything they're worth." Two guards stepped forward, grabbing Maya by the arms. She didn't struggle. She let them lead her toward the exit, her head held high. As she reached the door, she looked back at the engine one last time. It was a beautiful machine dying because of the arrogance of the men who thought they owned the truth. The ejection of Maya from the hangar was not a quiet affair. It was a public spectacle designed to strip away any remaining scrap of her dignity. The two security guards marched her through the main bay, past the rows of stunned junior engineers, and toward the cold, unforgiving sunlight of the loading dock. Julian Sterling trailed a few steps behind his face, a contorted mask of triumph and disgust. He wanted every soul in that building to witness the consequence of daring to challenge his authority. "Make sure she stays off the property," Julian barked at the guards, his voice booming for the entire staff to hear. "If she even breathes on the perimeter fence, notify the police. I will not have my hangar contaminated by her presence a second longer." As they reached the heavy metal doors, Julian stepped in front of Maya, blocking her path. He reached into her apron pocket, pulling out the frayed, oil-stained notebook she had tried to hide. Maya's heart leaped. It was the only connection she had left to her father. With a look of performative disdain, Julian leafed through the pages, his thumb smearing the ink. "Look at this," he sneered, holding the book up for the nearby mechanics to see. "Hand-drawn diagrams, calculations scribbled by someone who clearly never learned the difference between an engine and a toaster. It's superstition, Maya. It's the kind of garbage that your people cling to because you can't handle the complexity of the modern world. He didn't just hand it back. He ripped the middle pages, the ones containing the harmonic resonance calculations, into jagged pieces and let them flutter to the oil-stained concrete like fallen leaves. "Consider this a lesson," he said, his eyes burning with malice. "A black janitor's intuition is just another word for ignorance. Go back to your slum and stay there. You are a stain on this company's reputation." He gestured to the guards, and they shoved her through the door. The heavy steel latched with a final echoing thud. Maya stood alone in the cold wind, her hands trembling as she gathered the shredded remains of her father's life work. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. But as she stood there watching her reflection in the glass of the door, a different fire began to burn. It wasn't the heat of anger. It was the cold, sharp clarity of the truth. She knew the engine was going to fail completely if they didn't listen, and the consequences would go far beyond Julian Sterling's ego. Back inside, the hangar felt different. The air was charged with a lingering tension. Leo, the young apprentice who had been watching from the fuel console, felt a sickening knot in his stomach. He had seen the way Maya looked at the Titan X. It wasn't the look of a confused woman. It was the look of a master physician watching a patient die on the table. He looked at Julian, who was back to yelling at the senior engineers, demanding they recalibrate the software for the 10th time. "Sir," Leo said, his voice hesitant, "maybe we should consider the vibration readings again. The janitor, Maya, she mentioned the intake manifold." Julian spun around his face, turning that familiar dangerous shade of red. He stormed over to Leo, looming over the apprentice. "Do not ever mention that woman's name in my presence again, and do not let me hear you regurgitate her delusions. We are dealing with $50 million of aerospace engineering, not garage door fixing. If you can't follow the diagnostic manual, find the exit." Leo flinched, stepping back. He looked around the room, hoping for support, but the senior engineers were too busy covering their own tracks, blaming the sensors, the fuel, the ambient temperature, anything but their own hubris. Julian was unraveling his movements, becoming more erratic as the clock ticked toward the final demonstration deadline. He wasn't solving a problem anymore. He was fighting a war against the reality of his own failure. In the corner of the hangar, the Titan X sat silent, a massive dormant beast. It seemed to pulse with a low, mocking energy. Julian began dismantling the cooling assembly, for the third time, his hands shaking so violently he dropped a torque wrench. It skittered across the floor, coming to a rest right where Maya had been standing. The silence in the hangar was no longer professional. It was the silence of a tomb. They were trapped in a cycle of arrogance, blinded by the very technology that was supposed to make them gods. And outside in the cold, the woman who held the key was forced to watch her life's work being mocked by a man who couldn't even see the crack in the foundation. The stage was set for a disaster that would shake the foundations of the aviation world, and everyone involved was oblivious to the fact that they had just fired the only person who could save them. The mood inside the hangar had curdled into something toxic. Every attempt to restart the Titan X resulted in the same catastrophic seizure. The diagnostic readouts were now flashing warning colors, but Julian Sterling refused to acknowledge them. He was convinced that the issue was a software ghost, and he was currently buried in code trying to force the engine to accept a patch that had no business being there. Leo watched from his station, his frustration mounting. He remembered the calm in Maya's eyes. It wasn't the gaze of someone guessing. It was the look of someone who had seen this specific type of failure 1,000 times before. He recalled the way she had subtly adjusted the intake valve couplings months ago, fixing a problem the engineers had spent weeks scratching their heads over. He decided he had seen enough. While Julian was distracted with a cooling line pressure test, Leo slipped away. He didn't go to the senior staff. He knew they would just protect their reputations. Instead, he pulled out his phone and bypassed the internal communication systems, dialing a number he had seen on a confidential administrative memo, Elias Thorne's private line. "Thorne," the voice on the other end was cold-clipped and immensely powerful. "Mr. Thorne, this is Leo, an apprentice in the Titan X project," he whispered, pressing himself into the shadowed corner of the storage room. "We are going to fail. The engine is structurally misaligned, not software faulted. The senior staff is destroying it. There is someone who knows how to fix it, but Julian Sterling had her thrown out because of her position." There was a pause on the other end, a silence so profound it felt like the floor had dropped out. Thorne was not a man who suffered fools, but he was a man who hungered for results. "Who?" "Maya. She's the head of the custodial staff. She's the most brilliant mechanic I've ever seen, sir. She knows the resonance. Please just come down." The call ended. 5 minutes later, the main hangar doors began to rise, not for a delivery truck, but for the sleek obsidian black limousine of Elias Thorne. The entire hangar froze. Julian Sterling scrambled to pull himself together, his face plastered with a frantic, desperate grin as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Thorne entered the hangar. He didn't walk. He glided, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the room. He was a tall man with sharp, predatory features and a suit that cost more than a mid-range sedan. He didn't look at the engineers. He walked straight to the Titan X, tapped the casing with his ringed finger, and then turned to Julian. "Where is the engine, Sterling?" Thorne asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Mr. Thorne, we've had some minor telemetry issues. The software is perfect," Thorne interrupted, his gaze locking onto Julian. "The engine is dead. I was told there is a woman who knows why." Julian's face went pale. He stuttered, his eyes darting toward the security cameras. "Sir, you've been misinformed. It was a disgruntled employee, a janitor, who was hallucinating mechanical issues to justify her presence in sensitive areas. I had her removed for safety reasons." Thorne didn't blink. He walked past Julian, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Leo. "You," he pointed. "Where is she?" "She was escorted off the property, sir. She's likely at the bus stop on 5th and Main." Thorne looked at his lead security detail. "Go get her, now, and bring her here with respect." Julian grabbed Thorne's sleeve, an act of sheer desperation. "Mr. Thorne, you cannot be serious. You are going to trust the word of a person like that over a third-generation engineer. This will destroy the credibility of this company." Thorne peeled Julian's hand off his sleeve as if he were removing a piece of lint. "My credibility died when the engine stopped turning, Sterling. If she can't fix it, you're all fired anyway. If she can, you're the one who's gone." The hangar was deathly silent. The elite engineers stood like statues, their professional lives hanging by a thread. Leo felt a spark of hope. The arrogance that had dominated the room for hours was finally beginning to buckle under the weight of actual accountability. Outside, the rain began to fall, but inside, the air felt like it was about to explode. The power dynamics of the room had shifted, and for the first time in his life, Leo realized that the title on your badge wasn't nearly as important as the truth in your head. The return of Maya Hayes was an event that would be talked about in aviation circles for decades. When the black limousine pulled up to the hangar doors, the rain was coming down in sheets. The doors groaned open, and Maya stepped out. Her head held high, though her uniform was damp from the weather. She walked into the hangar with the same steady rhythm she had used to mop its floors for 3 years. She wasn't wearing an engineer's coat. She didn't have a security clearance badge hanging from her neck. She had nothing but her worn, oil-stained apron and the shredded, taped-up remains of her father's notebook held tightly against her chest. Julian Sterling looked as if he were having a heart attack. He stood at the edge of the assembly area, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He wanted to shout, to object, to remind everyone of her place, but the presence of Elias Thorne kept him paralyzed in a state of impotent rage. Thorne walked over to Maya. He didn't offer a hand, but his head bowed slightly, an acknowledgement of the power he sensed radiating from her. "You are the one who knows what is wrong with my $50 million. Maya looked at the Titan X. She didn't look at Thorne, and she certainly didn't look at Julian. She looked at the engine the way a doctor looks at a patient who is struggling to draw breath. "The engine is misaligned, Mr. Thorne. It's starving itself because the cooling vents are expanding and choking the intake manifold. The sensors aren't programmed to see the heat soak at the specific frequency of the idling turbine. It's not a broken part. It's a design failure." "That's a lie," Julian shouted, unable to keep silent any longer. "The intake manifold was designed by a team of 16 PhDs. It's perfect." Maya turned to him. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a profound, stinging pity. "It was designed for a computer, Mr. Sterling. It wasn't designed for the metal. Metal lives. It grows. It changes. Your design is too rigid and it's killing your machine." Thorne looked at Julian. "Quiet," he ordered. He turned back to Maya. "Can you fix it?" "I can," Maya said. "But I need the engine stripped back to the base mountings. I need the manual alignment jig, and I need the team to stop touching the software. They're making it worse." Julian laughed, a high, manic sound. "She wants the manual jig. That's from the 1970s. It's obsolete." Thorne looked at the senior engineers. "Do it." "Mr. Thorne, this is insanity," Julian yelled. "We have the world's best diagnostic equipment, and you want to listen to a janitor." Thorne grabbed Julian by the collar, pulling him close until their faces were inches apart. The coldness in Thorne's eyes was absolute. "Sterling, in the last 6 hours, your world's best equipment has accomplished nothing but to prove that you are an incompetent fool. If she says it's a structural misalignment, then we strip it down. If you don't follow her instructions to the letter, I will personally ensure that you never hold a wrench for the rest of your life. Do you understand?" Julian went limp. He nodded slowly, his face drained of all color. The hangar floor transformed into a battlefield of necessity. Maya walked to the central workstation. She didn't have a computer terminal. She had a set of hand tools in her notebook. She began directing the crew. "Tommy, pull the intake housing. Not the electrical array, the housing itself," she commanded. Tommy hesitated, looking at Julian for permission. Julian turned away, unable to watch. Tommy obeyed. For the next 20 minutes, the hangar was filled with the sounds of metal on metal, the clinking of wrenches, the slide of pistons, the heavy, deliberate movements of a woman who had spent years observing these very actions from the shadows. Maya didn't raise her voice, but every command she gave was precise, stripping away the complex, unnecessary layers the elite engineers had piled on. As they reached the third turbine, Maya paused. She placed her bare hand on the turbine casing. She closed her eyes. The room went dead silent. Even the security guards held their breath. She felt the micro-vibration, the subtle rhythmic pulse of the metal shifting under the cooling strain. "There," she said, opening her eyes. "There is the crack. It's so small your laser scanners missed it, because it only opens when the temperature hits the precise threshold of the ignition cycle. It's a hair's breadth, but it's enough to kill the pressure." She pointed. Graham, the senior propulsion specialist, leaned in with a portable magnifying scope. He adjusted the light, his breathing shallow. He looked at the screen, then at Maya. His face went as white as a sheet. She's right, he whispered. It's there. A hairline fracture. It's absolutely invisible to the standard rigs. A wave of shock rippled through the hangar. Julian gripped the edge of the workbench, his knuckles white. The power structure of the room had been decimated. The janitor wasn't just a janitor. She was the only one who had actually seen the machine. Maya simply looked at her father's notebook and started the next phase of the repair. The hangar felt like a pressurized chamber, the air so thick with tension that breathing became a conscious effort. Maya Hayes moved with the grace of someone who had spent decades preparing for this exact moment. She didn't rely on the flickering, frantic data of the digital displays. She trusted the lineage of her father's wisdom. She opened the weathered notebook to a page where the ink had faded to a ghostly sepia, revealing the complex, hand-calculated resonance formulas Elijah Hayes had developed in the silence of his shed. "Graham," Maya said, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "I need you to calibrate the manual alignment jig to the exact degree of the vibration offset. Don't look at the computer. Look at the mechanical load. You're trying to compensate for a ghost. I'm telling you to fix the skeleton." Graham, the senior propulsion specialist, hesitated for only a heartbeat before nodding. The hierarchy had collapsed the moment the hairline fracture was revealed. He felt a strange sense of liberation in taking orders from the woman he had spent years ignoring. As he adjusted the jig, Maya stood by the turbine, her eyes closed, her hand resting against the aluminum casing. She was listening. To her, the engine wasn't a collection of parts and code. It was a symphony. And right now it was playing a tune of catastrophic discord. "There." She breathed, her finger tracing a line along the turbine housing. "The tension is localized at 0.74. When you tighten the intake manifold, the heat soak forces the metal to expand outward, causing the seam to split at that exact point. It's not the part that's flawed. It's the seating torque." She pulled out a simple, old-fashioned torque wrench from her own bag, a tool she had bought at a pawn shop years ago and meticulously maintained. Julian Sterling, still standing in the periphery, felt his world crumbling. He watched as the most advanced aerospace engine in the world was being tuned by a woman using methods that belonged to a different century. He wanted to scream that it was impossible, that the physics didn't work like that, but the look of absolute, terrifying concentration on Maya's face silenced him. "You're going to torque the bolts in an unconventional sequence," Maya instructed, ignoring the bewildered glances from the other engineers. 3, 2, 1, then cross-load to 5, then back to 4. It will distribute the thermal expansion evenly across the mount. The computer will hate it, and the warning lights will blare, but the metal will finally be at peace. The team moved in a trance. They were the elite, the best educated, the highest paid, and yet they were now the hands and feet of a woman who had spent the last 3 years cleaning their waste. Maya moved from one point to another, her movements economical and precise. She was the conductor, and the Titan X was her instrument. Every time she touched a component, she seemed to know exactly how it would react before she even turned the wrench. Then there was the moment of the illogical detail. Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's antique pocket watch, the one that had run exactly 3 minutes and 12 seconds fast for 2 decades. She hung it on a hook near the diagnostic terminal. The younger engineers stared at it, whispering among themselves. It was completely useless for timing a rocket engine, yet Maya seemed to check it before every major adjustment. "Does she think that old thing is helping?" Leo whispered to Graham. Graham just shook his head, his eyes glued to the engine. "Don't ask questions. Just watch." Maya didn't care about the watch's inaccuracy. It was her anchor, her grandfather's pulse. As she tightened the final bolt on the intake manifold, the sound of the metal seating was like a sigh. The engine, which had felt like a dead, heavy block of lead moments ago, seemed to settle into its mounting with a strange harmonic readiness. "Check the alignment," Maya ordered. Graham ran the laser alignment rig again. The red beam pulsed against the metal, then settled. He stared at the readout, his breath catching in his throat. It's perfectly centered. Zero deviation. The internal stress is gone. The hangar was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Maya stepped back, her hands covered in grease, her face devoid of any triumph. She was simply a person who had done what was necessary. Elias Thorne stood by the observation window, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes unreadable. He had come here to see a failure, but he was witnessing a miracle. The pride of the Sterling family lay in pieces, and in its place something far more dangerous and far more brilliant was being born. The janitor had not only found the flaw, she had rewritten the manual. The moment of truth had arrived. The hangar, once a place of arrogant confidence and sterile efficiency, now felt like the threshold of a new world. The Titan X was fully assembled, its casing pristine, its internal stressors neutralized by the unorthodox touch of a woman the establishment had spent years calling invisible. Elias Thorne remained in the center of the room, his presence a silent command for everyone to witness the outcome. "Start the sequence," Maya said, her voice cutting through the tension. Julian Sterling moved as if in a daze, his authority shattered, his career effectively over. He looked at Maya, who didn't even acknowledge his existence, then at Thorne, who gestured for him to proceed. Julian tapped the ignition key. The hangar held its collective breath. The Titan X turned over. For a heartbeat there was silence and then a roar, but not the jarring metallic grind of the previous failures. This was a smooth, melodic, high-frequency thrum that resonated in the very marrow of everyone present. It was the sound of a perfectly tuned machine, a beast that was finally happy. The diagnostic screens, which had been screaming in red for hours, flickered and turned a brilliant solid green. The engine didn't just fire, it surged with power that exceeded the original specifications. "Readings," Thorne asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Power output, 5% above maximum capacity," Graham replied, his voice cracking. "Stability it's absolute. There's no vibration, none. It's the smoothest turbine operation in the history of the company." The room erupted. Not in cheers, not yet, but in a stunned collective exhale of disbelief. The engineers who had spent years on the project were staring at the screens, their mouths agape. They had spent millions, built laboratories, and hired the brightest minds, and yet a janitor with a tool belt and a book of handwritten notes had done what they couldn't. Julian Sterling, however, wasn't celebrating. He was standing by the secondary fuel terminal, his face a mask of bitter, impotent fury. Seeing that his reign of terror had been defeated not by an equal, but by someone he had spent years dehumanizing, was too much for his pride to bear. In a moment of sheer, small-minded vindictiveness, he noticed the ECU calibration cable still dangling near the main intake. He realized that if he could just force a surge through the terminal, he could trigger an emergency shutdown, causing the engine to fail one more time and casting doubt on Maya's success. He lunged for the terminal, his hand reaching for the override switch. He was quick-driven by the desperation of a man who had lost everything. But Leo, the apprentice, who had been watching his every move, saw the betrayal. "Stop him!" Leo shouted. Graham tackled Julian just as his finger grazed the switch. The two men crashed into the storage rack, sending tools flying across the floor. The force of the impact shook the terminal, but the engine didn't waver. It continued to roar a perfect, steady song of victory. Thorne's security detail swarmed the area, hauling Julian to his feet and pinning his arms behind his back. Get him out of my sight, Thorne ordered, his voice echoing with cold, final authority. And lock him out of every facility under my name. I want his credentials burned. Julian was dragged away, his face turning toward Maya one last time, not with remorse, but with a lingering, pathetic spite that only highlighted his own fall. He had tried to sabotage the very thing that had just saved his company, all because he couldn't bear to let a black woman be the hero. As the security detail hauled Julian out, the hangar turned toward Maya. The applause didn't start with a shout. It started with a single set of hands, Graham's, then Leo's, then the entire engineering team. It was a sound of collective shame and awe. They were clapping for a woman they had treated like a ghost, a woman whose name they hadn't bothered to learn until today. Maya stood before the Titan X, her hand resting on its casing. She looked at her father's notebook, at the frayed edges of the pages, and for the first time a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the engine, her partner in this silent, hard-won victory. The aftermath of the Titan X demonstration was a whirlwind that reshaped the entire aerospace industry. By the next morning, the janitor who saved the Titan was a global headline. News crews descended on the Seattle facility, and the viral video of Maya Hayes tuning the $50 million engine with her father's antique watch and a wrench became the most watched clip in the history of aviation. Elias Thorne, ever the pragmatist, knew exactly how to leverage the situation. He didn't just promote Maya. He handed her the keys to the entire research and development division. She was no longer maintenance. She was the lead engine specialist of Sterling Aerospace. The company underwent a radical transformation. The toxic elitist culture that had flourished under Julian Sterling was dismantled overnight. Thorne fired anyone who had participated in the systemic belittling of the support staff. In their place, a new generation of talent began to arrive, people who had been ignored by the top-tier universities, but possessed the same raw, brilliant intuition that Maya had demonstrated. The crowning achievement, however, was the unveiling of the Elijah Hayes Foundation. It was a massive multi-million-dollar scholarship and apprenticeship program designed specifically to recruit underprivileged youth from rural areas and marginalized communities. Maya insisted on it as the only condition of her contract. The foundation would provide these students not just with tuition, but with access to state-of-the-art facilities and mentors who understood that genius isn't defined by a diploma, but by the ability to listen. Maya's office was a small, quiet space overlooking the hangar floor. It was filled with nothing but her work. Her father's notebook sat in a glass-encased display in the lobby, a testament to the fact that brilliance could come from a corrugated shed in Georgia just as easily as it could from an Ivy League classroom. One afternoon, 6 months later, Maya stood on the gantry overlooking the hangar. Below her, a group of apprentices from the first Elijah Hayes Foundation class were working on a new engine prototype. She watched as a young, hesitant girl reached out to touch the turbine casing, closing her eyes just like Maya used to. She smiled. She felt a presence behind her. It was Thorne. "They're doing well," Thorne said, looking down at the team. "But they keep asking about the watch, the one that runs 3 minutes fast. They want to know if you're going to fix it." Maya pulled the watch from her apron. She still wore her apron even as a lead specialist. She looked at the face, the worn metal, and the hands that never quite aligned with the official time. "No," she said softly. "It doesn't need fixing. It reminds me that the world is always a little out of sync, and that sometimes you have to be the one to bridge the gap." She looked back at the engine. It was humming a low, rhythmic, perfect sound. The Invisible Woman had become the heartbeat of the entire company. She had proven that dignity wasn't a gift given by superiors. It was a right earned through excellence and an unwavering belief in one's own worth. Julian Sterling, meanwhile, was working as a clerk at a shipping warehouse in a town 3 states away. He had no window, no prestige, and no legacy. He spent his days filing paperwork for parts he would never understand, a man who had built his life on the idea that others were lesser, only to find that he was the one who had been small all along. Maya walked down the stairs to the floor. The apprentices stopped what they were doing and looked at her. They didn't see a janitor. They saw a legend. And as she picked up a wrench to join them, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a teacher. She had opened the door, and she knew that unlike the past, it would never be shut again. The engine was singing, the foundation was growing, and for the first time in her life, the world was listening. Life lesson: true competence does not hide behind degrees or titles. It reveals itself through dedication and an unwavering soul. People who look down on others based on their position or background are the ones truly blinded by their own arrogance. The world is full of hidden experts waiting for a chance to be heard. Don't let your biases keep you from learning the truth they carry. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their worth. Drop a comment below. What is a talent you have that the world almost missed? Subscribe to the channel to join our community of truth seekers.